Hello, and welcome to our session today about strategic capacity planning for products and services. This is chapter 5 in your operations management book, and this is part of the QDC1 course. So, what is capacity planning? Capacity, if you look at the definition, is the upper limit or ceiling on the load that an operating unit can handle. But simply put, capacity is basically the maximum amount of units that your factory can produce. And the goal is, as a business owner, somebody who owns a factory or even a service business, is you want to reach that equilibrium point where you match exactly the long-term supply capacity that you can, the amount of units you can produce, with what you predict to be the level of long-run demand, how many units people are going to buy. And of course, predicting the exact amount is not possible, but you want to get as close as possible to the demand. And when you reach that perfect point where you have the exact amount of capacity to meet the long-run demand, you are going to have the highest level of profitability, which is obviously what every business is striving for. Now, when you start planning your capacity, you have to answer three basic questions, which, when you think about it, make total sense. First of all, what kind of capacity do you need? And what does that mean? It means, what is capacity for you? Do you need machines? Do you need employees? Do you need trucks? Do you need computers? When you say capacity, when it implies to your specific production, what does it mean? Then the second question is, how much capacity do you need to match the demand? And as we mentioned before, you want to find that perfect point where you have enough capacity to match the exact amount of demand. And as I mentioned before, that's very hard to get, but you want to get as close as possible. And the third question is, when do you need it? So, for example, let's say that you predict that you're going to have a demand for 10 million units in the next 5 years. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have the capacity to produce 10 million units right now. It could be that you will be able to start with a smaller capacity and increase it as demand grows, especially when you introduce a new product. It takes time for people to learn about it. It takes time for demand to grow. So you want to be able to match your capacity to the variable demands you're going to see in the life cycle of a product. Now, if you look at the other related questions, again, they all make sense. Before you decide on how much capacity you're going to buy or add to your factory, you want to know how much it's going to cost. You want to know the potential benefits and risks. You want to know if you need to buy, like I mentioned before, all of it at once, or can you do it in small increments? And for example, if you buy, if you're producing cars, and the machines are huge, you can't, the machine is designed to do 1,000 cars a day. The fact that you can only sell 500 right now doesn't mean you can buy a 500 machine per day, 500 cars per day machine. It's just not possible. So sometimes, even if you want to buy capacity in small increments, it's not possible because of the sizes of the machines. And one of the most important questions when you want to add capacity or even design initial capacity is you have to make sure that everyone else in the supply chain can meet this capacity. So for example, let's say you will have a factory that produces 5 million units a day. And you have a perfect supply chain. The raw material comes in, the shipments go out on UPS trucks, whatever. Everything works perfectly for 5 million units per day. But suddenly you decide you want to double it. You want to go to 10 million units per day because there's more demand. You have to make sure that your supplier of raw materials can now double their capacity towards you, and the same thing with the UPS trucks. Make sure that UPS in your area has enough trucks to deliver 10 million units per day. So really, when you do all these capacity plannings, you have to look at the big picture. Now, capacity decisions are always strategic decision. And what do we mean by saying it? What do we mean by saying that it's a strategic decision is that we try to emphasize how important it is to plan your capacity correctly. Because if you make mistakes in terms of planning your capacity, you can very much ruin your business. And think about it as a, as a consumer. If you want to buy something, you go to a store and they say, oh, we don't have it right now, but we're going to get it in 2 weeks. Are you going to wait 2 weeks? Probably not. You're going to go to a store that has it. And that store just lost you as a customer for that particular item, but maybe they lost you as a customer forever because, they're not reliable. So not having enough capacity to meet demand can really cost a business, not just in terms of the money they're losing, but also in terms of reputation. But on the other hand, having too much capacity, you're wasting money on machines that are not being used. You're paying employees to produce stuff that you can't sell. So, you're going to ruin your business by spending more than you're making. How do we define and measure capacity? First of all, it's really important when you measure capacity to measure it in units that do not require updating. And that's why using currencies is not a good unit for measuring capacity. So using dollars or pounds or euros or whatever, that's not a good measuring unit because dollar values change. We have inflation, we have exchange rates. It's so variable that it's really going to change your capacity calculation sometimes on a daily basis. So what you want to have is you want to use a unit that is kind of fixed. For example, amount of iPhones that you can manufacture per hour. That's pretty much a fixed unit that you can then decide how many machines you want to buy based on the amount of iPhones per hour that you want to manufacture. Now, there are two very useful definitions for capacity. One is the design capacity, and the other one is effective capacity. Design capacity is the maximum output rate or service capacity that a machine or a process is designed for. And what that means is that we have a bunch of engineers that, they created this machine, they designed it, they manufacture it, and they have to come with a number when you buy it to tell you what is the maximum design capacity for this machine. And design capacity could be something that you can think about it as if a machine is designed to do 1,000 units per day, if you push it to do 1,001, nobody's guaranteeing that the machine is not going to explode, that you're not going to have defects, etc., etc. So, when people design machines, they have to put some kind of a limit as to the maximum capacity that this machine can do if you worked it in a perfect environment, 100%. Now, in reality, that never ever happens because no matter what machine you have, it's going to need some maintenance. You're going to need to load materials into it. You're going to need to have people, operate it. It's never the design capacity, and that's where we get effective capacity. Effective capacity is you take the design capacity, what the engineers designed the machine to have the maximum capacity, and you reduce allowances for personal time and maintenance. And effective capacity is really what is the maximum capacity you can get from this machine in real life, in the real world, not in a lab or on some engineer's board. Now, how do you measure the effectiveness of the system to make sure that you are getting the capacity that you want to get? You take the actual output, and the actual output is what you actually was able to get. If the machine was designed to do 1,000 and you got 900, the 900 is the actual amount of units you were able to produce. Now, actual output can never exceed effective capacity. And stop for a moment and think why. Why is it that actual output can never exceed effective capacity? It's because effective capacity is effectively the maximum that you can get from this machine. So there's no way your actual output can be more than this maximum because you define the effective capacity as the maximum that you can get from this machine in a real world situation. So we have two ways to measure effectiveness of a system. Efficiency. And efficiency equals the actual output divided by the effective capacity. So if, going back to the previous example, my machine is capable in terms of, effective capacity to do 1,000 units per day, and I was able to do 900, the machine got stuck for some time. I had some issues with getting the raw material. Doesn't matter. I was only able to get 900 units out of the machine. My efficiency is 90%. 900 over 1,000 gives me 90% efficiency. Now, the other measure for system effectiveness is utilization. And utilization is a factor of the design capacity. How much of the design capacity that the engineers and the designers of the machine came up with am I utilizing? So I take the actual output, let's say it's 900 like our previous example, and I divide it by design capacity. Let's say my design capacity for the sake of this is 1,200, and I divide, let me use my calculator, 900 divided by 1,200 units gives me a 75% utilization. Capacity strategies. There are only basically 3 strategies you can do with capacity. And when you think about it, it makes absolute common sense. Either you're leading, which means that you're building capacity in anticipation of the demand increases. So, you think, oh, demand is going to increase by 100 units per day. You just buy 100 more capacity. You purchase capacity to produce 100 more units per day. But the risk with leading here is that you might be wrong. You think that you're going to need 100 units per day extra capacity, but you're actually selling, demand is 50 units per day. So you just bought capacity you don't need. The next strategy is following. So following is like the exact opposite. You say, okay, I'm not going to buy any capacity until people need it. But what's the drawback is that you don't have a magic wand. Maybe you do, but most people don't have a magic wand that they can just go poof, poof, and then they have extra capacity. Capacity costs money and time and training employees and limited factory space. So by the time you add this capacity, you might lose the demand because you were not able to meet it. The third option is in between. It's tracking. Tracking is similar to following, but instead of going in big jumps, what you're trying to do is go and add capacity in small increments as you see demand going. And the tricky thing about tracking is the tracking. Is how do you track demand and get it as close as possible and match your capacity as close as possible to this demand. So this tracking mechanism can be pretty complicated. But in reality, most businesses would try to use the tracking because between leading and following, tracking seems to be the most cost-efficient way to go about capacity planning. Capacity cushion. No matter what strategy you do in terms of capacity, you gotta have a capacity cushion. Why? Because you never know. You never know what's going to happen. You never know in terms of the market behavior. If suddenly there's going to be a huge spike in demand, you need to have that safety cushion. So how do you calculate the capacity cushion you want? You take 100% minus utilization. And remember, utilization is how much of the design capacity you are using right now. So if your machine has a design capacity of 1,000 units and you're only producing 800 units per day, then you have a 20% cushion. And you always want to have capacity cushion. And it's not just because you want to, in terms of demands, make sure that you can meet any unexpected demand, but also in terms of machines. Machines, even though they're designed to work at a maximum utilization, you want to have that cushion in terms of maintenance and it's never, it's just kind of like your car can go at 200 miles an hour, but you don't want to drive it at 200 miles an hour all the time. I'm not sure that's the best example, but you understand what I'm saying. In terms of cushion strategies, Usually organizations that have greater demand uncertainty will have greater capacity. Obviously, if demand, it's very hard for you to participate demand, then you need to have a bigger cushion. But also companies that have standard products and services usually have greater capacity cushion. And if you ask why, it's because they can. If you have a product that is not very standard or a service that's not very standard, it's very hard for you to calculate your capacity cushion. If you have, if you're producing, let's say, iPhones, very standard product, it's much easier for you to be able to calculate and maintain a capacity cushion, which is a good thing, and it's why usually that's where you're going to see companies have greater capacity cushions. So steps in capacity planning. These 8 steps follow common sense, and really there's nothing here that you wouldn't do if it was your factory. First, you would estimate the future capacity requirement to be like, okay, I think I'm going to need 5,000 more units per day. Then you're going to evaluate your existing capacity and say, okay, today I can do 4,000 and I want to go to 5,000, so obviously there's a gap. I need to add 1,000 units capacity. You're always in business, this is going to be in any decision-making plan you'll see in the business world. You're going to identify alternatives, and that means, okay, you can buy a new machine, but hey, maybe you don't have to buy a new machine. Maybe you can use the existing machines and increase capacity because you have a cushion, because you're underutilizing, etc., etc. You always want to come with different options. You're going to conduct a financial analysis, okay, which one is going to be cheaper, which one is going to give me more profit. You're going to assess key qualitative. Qualitative means all those things that are not money, are not necessarily something that you can quantify in a scientific way or a measurable way. So, for example, how easy it is to use a new machine. What is the learning curve for a new machine? All kinds of, of things that are more personal, like the name implies, qualitative. They're about the quality of what you're going to do. And then you're going to select, obviously, the best alternative for the long run. Obviously, you don't want to add capacity every month, changing your capacity, because it's such a big decision. You're going to implement the best one. And of course, and you're always going to see this in any business decision kind of flow chart, you're going to have to monitor the results to make sure that you made the right decision. How do you calculate the capacity, the processing requirement, the capacity requirement, the requirements that you need? Now a lot of you see this thing and go, math, all these signs, I hate this. Fear not, this is super simple, and by the way, this is not going to be on the exam. You're never going to have to solve something as complicated as this on the actual exam, but it's really good to understand what this says, because it really makes sense. What this is saying if you want to know how many machines you need to buy, you basically need to take the amount of time it takes for you to manufacture a product. That's the PI. And the reason you have a PI is because most factories don't, they don't produce one product. They have, 10 products. So you're going to get, K is going to be 10 because you have 10 products. And you're going to run that sigma, that big E is sigma. You're going to sum up the requirements for all the different 10 products you have. But for the sake of this explanation, let's say you have one product. So if you want to know how many machines you need to buy, you take the amount of time it takes you to manufacture one product times the amount of demand you have for that product, divided by the available time you have to use the machine. And that's the tricky one where some people get confused. What does it mean, processing time available during planning horizon? I always find it funny how management textbooks try to make things that are very simple sound very complicated. I don't know if it's an ego thing, but it basically means how much time you're going to use the machine. So, okay, the maximum amount of time possible in a year is 365 days, right? Times 24 hours. That's the amount of hours we have in a year. But nobody can use a machine. I don't say nobody, but it's very rarely that you can use a machine 365 days, right? So if you calculate, you're going to get to, okay, you know, there's going to be maintenance. I need people with shifts. I'm only going to have 2 shifts, so each shift is going to be 8 hours. So I'm going to be only 16 hours a day, and then on the weekends, I'm not going to work the machines. You're going to come up with the total amount of time that you have to use this machine. So in order to know how many machines you're going to need to buy, it's simply time it takes to manufacture a product times the demand for the product divided by total amount of time you have per machine equals the amount of machines. Very, very, very straightforward. So let's take a numerical example. If it takes half an hour to produce one unit of whatever I want to sell, and I have a demand for 20,000 units, and I have 2,000 machine hours. So that's half times 20,000, which gives me 10,000, divided by 2,000, which would give me 5. I will need 5 machines to meet this capacity. Optimal operating level. This, again, math, graphs. Fear not. This makes total sense when you think about it. What this graph is showing is that you have on one side, on the left side, you have the average cost per unit, and then on your X line, you have the rate of output. And what this graph is showing is that the average cost per unit goes down the more units you're producing until it reaches an optimal rate. And that makes total sense when you think about it. Let's take an example. I buy a machine, and the machine cost me $1 million. Now, this machine, if I produce only one thing on it, one unit on it, I just spent $1 million per unit. Now, if I produced 1 million units from this machine, it's going to cost me $1 per unit. So that just follows simple logic. The more I'm producing from a machine, the more I get, the total cost per unit is going to go down until I reach the optimal equilibrium point where I have the minimum cost and the optimal output rate. Now, what happens at a certain point is that the average cost per unit is going to start going up. And this sometimes is a little bit counterintuitive if you don't think about it. But if you take a moment to think about it, this also makes sense. Because, let's say, for example, I have a factory and, I want to extend the capacity by having my workers work on the weekend. They're going to say, fine. But if you want me to work on the weekend, you're going to have to pay me time and a half. So suddenly, even though I have more capacity because I'm having my workers work on the weekend, the price per hour for a weekend work hour is time and a half. So my cost is going to go up. And it's going to reach a point, actually, which isn't shown on this graph, where it's going to cost me more. The marginal cost is going to cost me more to produce another unit than I can actually sell it. So really, in terms of economics, I want to always be at that middle point, the optimal output rate, where I have the minimum cost with the maximum output for that cost. Economies and diseconomies of scales is just what we just spoke about a minute ago, just saying it in words, which is economics of scale is as long as you can push the output rate and reduce the cost per manufacturing of the unit to reach that optimal point, you're in economies of scale. Once you go over that optimal level and you start paying more, per production of cost, because like we said, you have to pay time and a half suddenly because you want people to work on the weekend, that's called diseconomies of scale. Cost volume relationships. In terms of the exam, this is not going to be in the exam. Like you're not going to be asked to calculate variable cost and fixed cost and stuff like that. But what's interesting to show here is the principle of cost volume relationship, which, as we spoke about before, there is a point, there is an equilibrium. You can't just manufacture more and more and more and reach an infinite amount of units, which is going to basically cost you almost zero to produce. Otherwise everybody would do it. It doesn't work like that. There is a point in economics, and if you didn't take the economics and finance courses, then this might not, you might not fully understand this. But once you take those, and if you have already taken those, you'll fully understand that there is a point of break even, and break even is when the cost, when you reach a point where you manufactured enough units that you are covering your fixed cost, and from that point on, every extra unit that you are manufacturing is becoming a variable cost. But again, don't really worry about it. Just understand and fully grasp the concept that there is an optimal level of capacity, there is an optimal level of manufacturing that you want to reach, and it's not infinite. You can't just just have infinite capacity and manufacture infinite amount of units. So this is the last slide, and this is basically tries to sum it up. And what you're getting from this chapter, chapter 5, and in the book they cover a few more aspects that I didn't talk about, but generally what chapter 5 is trying to tell you is that when you are planning capacity, that it's a very, very important decision. If you're going to build a factory, if you're going to start your own business, you really have to take into consideration how important it is to match the capacity that you want to have. And capacity can be the amount of employees you're going to hire. It's not only machines or factories. You're going to start a small startup. Are you going to hire 5 computer engineers? Are you going to hire 10? Obviously 10 is going to hopefully get the job done faster, but it's going to also cost you a lot of money. So really, when you go into the decision of capacity, it's not just, okay, yeah, let's just get as much as possible, more is better. No, sometimes more is not better, and you want to make sure that it really matches your strategic overall goals and, like they said all over the chapter, your expected demand. I hope this helps you understand chapter 5, but I also highly recommend to read it and at least skim through it, and definitely go to the book website and answer the chapter quiz questions. Have a great day. Bye bye.